Then I think we're ready, Julie. And third in our three-part set of presentations today, I am pleased to get to introduce Ray Gastil. He directs the Remaking Cities Institute at Carnegie Mellon. RCI focuses on resilient regions, community engagement, urban design, and mobility adapted to emerging technologies, reuse of legacy structures, health and resilience towards a more just, equitable, and responsive urbanism. As former Pittsburgh City Planning Director, he led neighborhood planning, resilient community, housing, waterfront, preservation, and mobility initiatives. Earlier, Ray directed long-range planning in Seattle and served as director in Manhattan, New York City planning, and founding director of the Van Allen Institute. He also served as a transit-oriented design director for the Regional Plan Association. He holds an MArch from Princeton. Ray Gastil has lectured and published on urban design, urban development, and waterfronts, including Health by Design, Challenges for Urban Transformation, which was sponsored by Georgetown's Global Urban Health Collaborative and Global Cities Initiatives in 2019. His publications include Complexity and Continuity in the Transformation of Pittsburgh's Rivers and Waterfronts in River Cities, City Rivers, which was published by Harvard in 2018. And earlier, Success Looks Different Now, Design and Cultural Vitality in Lower Manhattan, and Beyond the Edge, New York's New Waterfront. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ray, and I hand you the microphone for your presentation.
Hi, thank you very much, Malia. Thanks for the introduction. And I'm really pleased to be part of the Adaptive Preservation, it's what I would call an Adaptive Preservation Conference, but is better known as the NCPE Conference. I want to talk a little bit about the title and theme of this talk, which is I want to start with the recognition that historic preservation is already a very big tent, and I understand that. And so in using the term adaptive preservation, well, yes, I'm doing a kind of a pun between adaptive management and historic preservation. I realize that the way that people in this conference and in this field work every day is a very adaptive way, and which is responsive to the challenges at hand. And I really, we face this. I mean, we're adapting to the pragmatic challenges of preservation every day, from financing to construction. And at the same time, we're grappling with the aspirational challenge that we have to meet of connecting preservation goals to our deepest beliefs regarding culture and memory, diversity, equity and inclusion, and sustainability. And I just want to underscore, I realize that the practice and literature in this arena is broad and deepening, and I really appreciate the work that people are doing. Now, here I've done the sort of visualize the pun, and I just want to state this, the sort of the adaptive preservation, because I've been involved in historic preservation and adaptive reuse through most of my career, one way or another. And actually my initiation to a formal historic preservation process was serving on a committee in the Section 106 process regarding the World Trade Center after its disaster in New York. At the time I headed a nonprofit focused on architecture in the public realm. More recently, before becoming director of the Remaking Cities Institute at Carnegie Mellon, I served as city planning director in Pittsburgh, and where I and my department had the key responsibility for land use and review, but this work also included historic preservation. And so what I'm doing here today is really a kind of work in progress of trying to better understand and learn from that experience so that I can apply it more broadly in the field. So this slide is, I called it Scale and Continuum. I could have called it a really big tent, different things to call it. But I'm showing it because this is from the Hot Metal Bridge, which crosses the Monongahela River in Pittsburgh. And I'm showing it because this has the sort of the scale issues are here in many different ways. If you look into this slide, you'll see at the time, this is about a few years back, you'll see a very undeveloped and unchanged brownfield site, essentially, the 170 acres of Hazelwood Green. If you look right in the very middle, next to one of the steel verticals, and see a white building with a sort of rusty roof, that's one of the projects we're looking at. That's Mill 19. Now, these are here because I want to make a point about scale, not only the scale of the region, which, as you'll hear in another talk, at one point produced 50% of the steel in the world and it is a regional and metropolitan challenge in terms of its transformation, in terms of adaptive reuse. But secondly, just the scale of the site, 178 acres in a city, the largest undeveloped or brownfield site in the city. And then the scale of the building, which here looks tiny, but which is a 1,200-foot long building, which is formerly there was steel made in it, there were munitions made in it, and then it was a Coke factory bricks were stored there. So this is the other building, the one that's actually the primary focus today, which is now seems to move to official name of Strip District Terminal. It was more typically known as the Produce Terminal. It was also known, the building, and especially the head house of the building, was called the Pennsylvania Railroad Fruit Auction and Sales Building. And so I'm showing it as it currently is. Now this one measures in at 1,533 feet long by 100 feet. They're both about 100 foot wide. And I'm showing them because, like, the point here is there's a scale of challenge, which I want to talk about more, but just in terms of the massive content of buildings and the sort of the portfolio of buildings, whether it's in the industrial sector, whether it's in houses of worship, or whether it's in schools, that region, the Pittsburgh region, and also regions like it across many parts of North America face. It's something that we can't ever stop thinking about it. So I'm sort of literalizing the scale by picking really big buildings. But even as we look at what should be the priorities for preservation, especially as we continue to look at whose history and what are we really preserving and what should be the emphasis of our work with the limited resources we have. At the same time, this is a legacy that I don't think is going away at any time soon. These huge buildings are ones which actually can be quite successful, but they're going to take a way of working and a way of thinking about it that forces us to question and at the same time continually kind of adapt to, like, where do we stand as people that believe in historic preservation and adaptive reuse. So let me show you the stages of change. We're going to start really looking at this one, the produce terminal, which is now just, if it weren't for COVID, the novel coronavirus, I think it would be open at this time. And much of the work is completed, but at the same time, this is a long period. It's about 10 years of gestation that I'm going to talk about. So this is looking back at 2018 when the street nothing had been changed, but there was already the inklings of change and the intentions of change in something like this, which was the street, not the building itself, which actually you're looking at the one part of the building that did have an active use as the Center for Contemporary Craft. But the street itself on a open streets PGH, kind of the ciclovia of Pittsburgh, which opened up a stretch from Lawrenceville to downtown and included and incorporated this area of Smallman Street adjacent to the produce terminal, was a way of celebrating and looking at how special this place was. People knew from their everyday life that it was special, yet at the same time during the day it was largely an abandoned space, although it provided some parking. And it had historically in the evenings in its sort of post-industrial mode been a place for clubs and so forth, but that was also has been changing rapidly over the last few years. So this is a temporary use, but it's one that had implications for many of the issues that I'm going to bring up. Now, as I look at this building today, I'm not going to go into, I'm going to tell a bit about the process, a bit about the historic review process that it encountered directly and indirectly. And then I'm going to focus on that rather than the whole picture of public financing, which I will touch on and which is relevant to the larger picture of how do we build a better tent. This is its context. It's a former, Smallman Street is a former rail yard. That's why it's so wide. It has a remarkable church at the end from the 1880s, St. Stanislaus Kostka. Was a site for distribution. It was, as I mentioned, it served as a parking resource for the district it's in, and the food district, which I'll show in a moment. But also something that's going to keep coming up and as part of when you're considering the character and transformation and trying to adapt to many different objectives and goals other than beyond the maintaining or sustaining or transforming character, is that it's throughput. This is vital to the network of streets. And we did not, throughout this process, find a way to imagine this no longer being part of a vital system of streets. That precluded any number of the kind of sort of more almost pedestrian oriented or sort of very slow space or Warnorf kind of ideas that came up. Those were not possible to actually achieve. Also adjacent, if we're looking down to west in this case towards downtown Pittsburgh, this site is very much the strip district, which is defined by its location. And this 5-block long building from 16th to 21st Street is very close to both the convention center and downtown proper itself. It's also, as I mentioned, adjacent to Penn Avenue. This is largely known for food and also some sports, some Steelers swag, but mostly known for the incredible resources in terms of long-standing food businesses that are located here, as well as an entertainment function. Although it's the sort of daytime food uses which it is most noted for. This is a block away from the terminal. And then it's actually, people sometimes don't realize this, it's also adjacent to a hill, which happens to be the Hill District, which is just above the tree line there, and which in fact historically was connected to the Strip District and to this area at 17th Street, one of the blocks, only a block away from the produce terminal, was one of the largest inclines in the world, which took passengers from the 19th century until it ended its service in 1953 on a funicular up 330-foot rise to the Hill District. Also on another edge, this is the river. This is the Allegheny River, and what you'll see here, this is also the borders. This is the edge of this, which is this is the cork factory, which was one of the first historic preservation projects of taking a factory that closed in 1971 after opening in 1901, opened in 2006 as a residential loft building. So nearby, and this is a little more, a little bit different date, 1986, we had a huge building with a large steel structure, which was used, that became in 1986, the National Robotics Engineering Center from a 19th century foundry building. This is only about 15 blocks away, as very much part of the same kind of system of locations and system of buildings that we're looking at here. And then more recently, kind of a next generation of looking at this is sort of using these steel frames as kind of a centerpiece and a frame of reference, in this case for a mixed-use building at 41st, only directly adjacent to the engineering center. And then here is a most recent one, which is actually only a couple blocks away from the terminal, and which is again, office largely, although part of a larger complex, which will also have residential. So I'm showing those just sort of some of the ways in which dealing with these artifacts have been not a classic preservation goal, in which they've done things like remove cladding or radically alter the sort of exterior structure of building while maintaining some aspects of it, and maintaining it not necessarily for a reuse that's internal or interior, but rather for one that might be an exterior space and be actually turned over to the public realm, is both for symbolic and pragmatic reasons. But here at the produce terminal, the main issue that happened about this as a resource was that the first plan for its adaptive reuse actually knocked off the 500 feet of it. And that was what it was part of a larger plan to redevelop towards the waterfront in a major mixed use development. But it was determined that it was essential to lose this sort of 500 feet so that we could have a better access between the Strip District and Penn Avenue and the waterfront. So, but it went through an interesting process, which I'm just going to summarize here. Those of you in the field will understand this, that it does get a National Register designation. Then it gets this kind of special district, which is including knocking off 500 feet approved. Same year, it is nominated for a city landmark. But in the end, in 2014, the City Council, the Planning Commission approves it and the Historic Review Commission approve it on its way to being a landmark, but the City Council votes it down. And they vote it down in part because there's this existing plan to move it forward. When Mayor Peduto comes in, he starts with a commitment, essentially, I don't want to knock down this western third of the building. And so it goes through a long period of proposals of what can be done with it, often starting with residential, but by the end, it's determined that residential is not an optimal use for it. And so it moves to a commercial use. In 2016, it has a sort of designated developer, moves through a process, which I was part of as my professional work in many ways, and then including Section 106 process because there were public funds involved with the street work, and which the State Historic Preservation Office determined that this had to be thought of as being the street and the terminal had to be thought of as an inextricable relationship, which indeed they referenced the original 2012 National Register strip district designation to make that determination. So, and just framing it a little bit, since we haven't shown this, this is the sort of the head house of the terminal building, which is at 21st, which the issues around it were largely not in terms of its preservation, but rather around the use, which ultimately the current developer worked with and provided resources to move the existing tenant to a new building, which is in Lawrenceville, which was the Contemporary Craft Center. So here's the street in 2014. You can see it's a building that's a humble building, not in fantastic shape, and a street which is really in kind of, is a wide street, but it's already lost. It had historically Belgian block. By this point, the Belgian block has already been buried under a lot of asphalt, and there was sort of no way to bring it back. But these are some of the issues that were brought up. And I'm going to bring up both ones that were part of the Section 106 process or referenced in those exchanges, and those that were not, that were sort of larger ones as efficiently as I can. And the other point to make here is this did at one point, part of the capital plan for this was historic tax credits. That plan was actually, I think, largely over one or two issues in which I want to do further research to confirm this, but largely over one or two issues that was determined, decided to go without the tax credits. But at the same time, there was a Section 106 for the reasons I mentioned. So looking at the building, the main thing I mentioned, which was really before it even went through the more recent historic conversation, was to maintain the whole building. That was the foundational issue. That was sort of the city and the URA basically said that is the basis is we're retaining the building. Second was that there were these cut-throughs in the original that were proposed to allow to get through the building, and even cars at grade would get through the building. Finally, reason prevailed that not only should a roof line be preserved, but also that the cut-through should be pedestrian, so that we don't have to cut down to grade above the level, the sort of 36-inch level of these platforms. And that was a profound decision in terms of the building, because it's one of its most important characters is its incredible length and repetition. And so that aspect of it was maintained. The platform was one issue as well in terms of the way and you'll see this when I go to the next slide, and also the windows and doors. I'm showing you this here because these are the doors, of which there's 104 on this side, which have been preserved, as well as sort of the character of these platforms. But you'll find that was one of the main sticking points, which was not effectively resolved, was that the doors on this side, which were many in disrepair, but I think largely also a developer decision that they could not accommodate preserving the doors and successfully lease these spaces facing Smallman Street, this was not resolved. So essentially, the doors was the solution was that the doors stayed on the back and that there was transformation on the front, and that was recognized. This is, you can see, they have put in what in some cases may be transformed later, but these are essentially plate glass doors that sort of different tenants may do different things with in the future, and windows really. Here's the platform, which was a kind of obviously a loading dock, has been extended approximately 6 feet from its 5 foot. I think it's a little bit sort of it goes, and that movement, in any kind of classic kind of review, it is important that there be a very clear delineation, and there is one in this case. There was also, on the street, there were questions of trees, the width, the appearance of width, furniture, light poles, multimodal, and other adaptive reuse issues. And the first were actually ones that were of concern to SHPO. This is a rendering of the project, which shows the trees. They're sort of a cluster of trees, but not a grove in a way, but not actually trying to put them as though it had ever been a street, sort of a street from the 19th century of a commercial or residential street that would be tree lined. The goal was to avoid that. The goal was also, as you can see from this view, to make sure that there still was a large open feeling view of the church at the end of the perspective. And there was also significant work being done on the right side of the image, which was the right side of the image. So this is, some of the issues are here that will come up, and we'll look at them in a moment. So here's what happened. The things that were most important from some perspectives were that we did actually achieve a kind of an edge to this. This was an edge that was not sort of part of historic vision per se, but rather one that would still have some of the character of industrial materials, like the wood that was used for the benches, or the decision to have utility poles, which were also quite contextual, but sort of put in a new form. Because again, the challenge of not creating an impression that this was a traditional downtown street, but rather had been something different in an industrial district. If you put a row of kind of standard semi-historic light fixtures along here, that would have been a kind of impression that was like not an industrial impression. At the same time, it was a transformative vision of what an edge could be in this area. What didn't happen was that a lot of ideas about how to make sure the pavement was much like the sidewalk and so forth, this had so much work to do as a street in terms of there's still truck and freight deliveries here. It is actually an important part of a network. And then also the biking community felt very strongly that this was the opportunity they needed to get a bike path that took them from the existing bike path, which stopped at a certain point on 16th Street on Penn Avenue, and connect it and have it carry on towards Lawrenceville. This was a solution that it may be a temporary one in terms of a longer one, but at the same time, it was a really high priority in the community meetings. So, and finally, there was a really high priority put on parking. And that was not by any means exclusively the developer's interest. That was in the community meetings that were held. There was a constant emphasis that parking should not decline, and that it would be bad not only for these businesses, but for the existing businesses in the strip. And finally, trees. And I'm going to just show this tree image because this is not a particularly handsome image of trees, but basically there were planning requirements that there be a certain amount of trees planted along the edge of this property. In order to meet that, in the end, there were clusters, sort of a compromise was worked out by clustering the trees mostly on the rear side of the elevation. This is a challenge for any kind of place. Again, it's a real challenge in terms of the balance of what is a sustainability objective, which the trees were, not simply an aesthetic objective, but also in what are the character objectives that you might have in a historic project. And finally, the light poles. I already mentioned them, but I'm just going to show you the context briefly. The desire was not to recreate this context. At the same time, since these weren't coming down because there was no budget for utilities going below grade, and that it seemed like meaningful to actually try and have a different kind of light pole, and one that might be more contemporary, and one that might have a greater meaning, a different language that had some relevance to the past here. And I mentioned already the surface that we had, that it was already long gone, and that the challenges here, while there will be a plaza in front of the church, the challenge of creating a kind of a uniform, sort of Belgian block, alternative material, was one that was just not surmountable for this project in terms of budget and also use. I just want to note that the happy news is that while it's still not open, people have already found its benches and this edge of the building irresistible. I think it's a very good sign for its potential to actually meet a lot of the goals that were on the minds of SHPO, on the minds of the city, on the minds of the RA, and on the minds of the community as well. So this is an interior view. And I want to move on to just look at this other one, Mill 19, which I showed you a tiny glimpse of in the distance first. This one is, you'll see here that you're seeing a sort of a framework that was kept, but then there's these new projects that are being inserted into it, which is a sort of a very clever architectural endeavor. It's one that was different because it wasn't on a well-known street a well-known with multiple uses, and it's not, nor is it sort of located adjacent to an important network street as well as a character and experience street. But at the same time, it was a structure that was seen as giving identity to a new development, which could have ultimately as many as 3 million or even 4 million square feet of space, and more than 3,000 units of housing potentially on these 178 acres, most of it new. So how do you actually respect and harness the historic element? This is how it's cited here. You see Mill 19 in the upper portion of it, 1,200 feet long. What you're seeing below is a temporary use by Uber as a test track, which sort of gives you a little sense of the relationship of tech to these sites. And then, I noted already the character of this, and there will also be open space as part of this plan. We'll get to that in a moment. So here is what it was not so long ago, 1943 building, clad, and with the Cathedral of Learning, Pitt, in the distance. It's a very close proximity to the university economy and practice of the city. This is getting unclad, which looks a little bit like those structures that we saw in, that I showed upriver, the ones that were using a sort of metal framework, a shed framework as part of the identity of a project. But what they've done here is gone to the next level, in which here it's integrated in a system of mobility as well, but it's solar on the top. They basically unclad it, but they put a roof on, a roof of solar panels, which is part of a sustainability mission, not only for this project, but for the entire site. So we're just gonna look at that for a moment. These are enormous crane systems, gantries, which would move these sort of both steel, but also were part of the munitions factory that this was for many years through World War II. And this is the kind of new architecture which has been inserted as kind of boxes within this framework. And this gives you an overview of it. And you can see that their solar is consistent through the system. They finished parts A and B. There's very serious tech related and university tenants that are occupying it now in the new structures that are based within this steel frame. There's also, you're looking to, the landscape was done by Dirt Studio, which is sort of and together with 10 by 10, very integrated approach to stormwater management and experience. Architecture is noted. And then also on the right, it will be a new park, which is by Gustafson Guthrie Nickel, the Seattle-based firm headed by Catherine Gustafson. So when we look at these two projects, where I've asked you to think with me about what does it mean to put the resources, which these are very high resource projects. I think the estimate for the project of the building at the produce terminal is 62 million, although I believe that includes some of the street and furniture work. The overall project is recorded as about 70 million. There were in that project. Here, this was the Regional Industrial Development Corporation, which had a slightly different approach. But again, these are high capital projects. But I'm looking, and as indeed will be the overall project of the Hazelwood Green. What I'm looking at here is across the ground, which will be partly with the, partly have the park that I just mentioned. And there are any number of programs. ARM has the Advanced Robotics Manufacturing from CMU, has a workforce program, which is meant to engage, if not the most immediate community, but the larger community of folks that are not typically brought into that type of work and into technology. They have an inclusive innovation approach to that workforce. There also will be any number of programs associated with the open space, both the park and more broadly this overall site. And then it is also related and responsive to a neighborhood plan that was developed by the community after years of trying to get going. A neighborhood plan was finished a year and a half ago, in which, and its relationship with this huge new site is critical. But I'm showing you the neighborhood in this picture just to point out a couple of things, which is these are, when I mentioned the scale of the challenge, which is not just about 1,200-foot long buildings, as important and I think inspirational as they can be, and I think we should continue to find ways to have resources for that type of project. But at the same time, we have projects like, look, on the left, we see the Gladstone School, sort of proud public school that sort of ceased functioning decades ago. and then the church. And you know, these are both schools and churches, two of the enormous reuse challenges in the region and nationally, and the housing stock as well. And so these are choices we're going to make in the field. And that's what I wanted to talk about, and how we can make better choices and how we can sort of work for a robust model that takes into account this incredible sustainability imperative that we have, because there is adaptive reuse is almost the single most important thing that people involved with the built environment can do if they want to take carbon reduction seriously. All the models show that it's simply the single most important thing to do. Secondly, I think that there is a cultural sustainability, which is also relevant in many ways. And again, is it about these enormous buildings like this, or is it really going to be about much humbler buildings and about ones that have a different history, and a history that is not as well known as having been a munitions factory during World War II, or a major steel and coke plant? So but my hope is that with the kind of attention to this, with carrying on, and with some of you'll be hearing from other speakers about the kind of strategies that you do this, that is part of a larger plan, that we need to kind of make sure that we have all the tools and all the open-mindedness that we can have, even as we set our own standards about sometimes classic historic preservation, sort of local law is the absolute right way to go. But other times there's going to be projects like the one, like these, which are probably not going to fit that model, yet at the same time, from a larger perspective, are very important as well, at least from how I see it and how I see the challenge for the field of how do we address this today, to get to the kind of resilient regions and resilient cities that I think all of us believe in, and all of us believe that preservation and conservation, and in some cases adaptation and transformation of structures, are all part of that work. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ray, for that wonderful third part of this ongoing discussion. For those who have heard only from Ray, please know that there's also a part 1 and part 2 of this series, where we heard from Rachel Weber and then Don Carter. And I will share my screen to show that the final portion of this presentation, if you can, perfect. The final portion of this conference is a moderated discussion, which will be held on October 26th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. To register to be part of that discussion, you can go to the nicp.us website, and also feel free to send questions in advance so that we can have a robust discussion with all 3 of our speakers today. As I conclude, I want to make sure to thank Julie Johnson, who is responsible for capturing these presentations and uploading them to NICP's YouTube channel, where you're presumably viewing them now, and also to the conference committee, Paul Kapp and Michael Tomlin, who brought in these wonderful presentations and got these discussions going. Thank you again to our moderators, and I look forward to the interactive discussion among us, between you guys, among all of us, on the 26th. Thank you so much.